Hi, it's Pastor Andy with Monday's discipleship video. And the title of this, Whose Gospel, might be a little bit perplexing to you. But the reason that we're talking about this is that in Romans 16:25, Paul makes a statement in the possessive, and he calls the gospel my gospel. We know that the word my is possessive. I'm not just wearing this shirt. I am wearing my shirt. Now, doesn't mean I can't give it away, but if I give it away, then it becomes your shirt, unless I loan it to you, in which case it is still mine, you're just using it. So to use a word like my is a possessive form, and the question is what gospel is Paul talking about if he's referring to his gospel? Well, some people have taken this to mean that Paul has adapted the gospel for his own purposes. Now, most scholars and commentators do not believe that that is true. I do not believe that that is true, in part because we find evidence throughout Paul's letters that he's not just talking about his own gospel. In fact, at the beginning of this letter, in Romans chapter 1, verse 1, he says that he is set apart for the gospel of God. So, it's not just about his gospel, and if we look at the letter to the Romans, we see in Romans chapter 3 that he's talking about justification, the justification that we have through Jesus. Romans 4 talks about the faith that we need, like Abraham's faith. Romans 5 talks about the fact that it was Jesus who came to overcome what Adam did, and we could go through this exercise through most of the rest of the book of Romans. So, but the point is that this letter that Paul is writing, and then he concludes by saying, my gospel is orthodox in relationship to the faith, not just from others of Paul's writings, but from the very words of Jesus, who says in John 3:16, whosoever believes, as most people know it, but the original construct of that was whosoever faiths in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. So it is by faith that we are saved, and we see Paul echoing that not just throughout Romans, like in chapter 4, but also in Ephesians and elsewhere. Another example of this would be found in Galatians chapter 1, when Paul says that if anyone, including himself, or even an angel from heaven, came and shared a different gospel, let that person be cursed. Would Paul be saying, I want to be cursed because I'm not sharing the truth of God's gospel? Of course he wouldn't do that. So we also find another hint about this not just being Paul's gospel in verse 25, right here. It says, now to him who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ. So there's our hint that Paul is not just talking about his gospel, about something that he has made up. This is about Jesus. Now, again, some people, if we look at the word of, the preaching of Jesus Christ, you might say that today's video is the teaching of Andy Braams. Okay, so it's Andy Braams' teaching would be an easier way to say that. And somebody could make that same argument here, again, from the way the syntax is written, that it is the preaching that Jesus did. But in the context of what we have in this passage, and in the context of Romans, and in the context of the Bible, that's not what Paul means. He's not saying what Jesus preached. He's not saying that's not important. He's saying in this context, my gospel includes and is about preaching about Jesus Christ. It is preaching Jesus Christ, the message of Jesus, and the good news that he brings to the people. Now, I realize that may clear up the argument for some. You may not have realized there was an argument about this, and that's okay too. But there's a lot of little details that people will look at and argue over at times, and it is important to make sense of it. But if that didn't convince you, if what I've said so far didn't convince you, just give me a couple more minutes to have you think about something a little bit different way. You have likely heard, or perhaps you've even said, something about the Gospels. And when I say the Gospels in the New Testament, I mean Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And what you might say or what you might have heard would be something like the Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew's gospel. Or turn in John's gospel to the story of the woman at the well in John chapter 4. Now, again, if I say Matthew's gospel, John's gospel, Luke's, Mark's, etc., or I might say, do you remember in the gospel of Luke where Jesus taught the parable about the lost sheep? Well, the gospel of Luke, Matthew's gospel, the gospel of Mark, John's gospel. The apostrophe S on Matthew and John's makes it possessive. The of makes it possessive. And so, just like Paul saying my gospel here, we're not saying that it is Matthew's gospel. This is not the gospel of Matthew, even though we use that terminology. We're not saying that this is the gospel of John. This is not the gospel about John. It's what John recorded. In fact, what is interesting is that in the title of each of the Gospels, the actual title says the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke. So it's not their own Gospel, it is their version of the Gospel according to what happened. This is how I saw it. This is how I saw it. This is my purpose in writing. And we need to understand that Matthew, for instance, was writing to the Jews, Mark to the Romans, Luke to the Greeks, and John to a group a little bit later known largely as the Gnostics. And so they had a different purpose for writing, so the information that was included is slightly different. Now there's a lot of parallels, there's a lot of overlap. But for instance, the only miracle that is found in all four Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. John is the only one who talks about the rising of Lazarus, a major miracle. But the purpose of his writing was different than, let's say, Mark's writing. All of them talked about the death by crucifixion, the raising from the dead, the ascension. All of that was important to all of them. But that according to, the gospel according to, which is how the Greek lays it, kata Matthian, kata Markan, kata Lucan, kata Johannan, as it's written in the Greek, and the word kata means according to. So, while it may make sense to use the actual title, like the gospel according to Luke, most don't, and that's okay. But it doesn't change the meaning, just as here in Romans 16:25, Paul using the idea of my gospel doesn't change the meaning that the gospel is really about Jesus. It's just how Paul is presenting that gospel, just as Luke presented it one way and Mark presented it one way as well. So, Paul didn't think that the gospel belonged to him, didn't think it was about him. The good news was, is, and always will be about Jesus the Christ. Words are important, and I would argue that maybe Paul could have maybe written this a little bit more cleanly than he did, but maybe using a different pronoun instead of my, he could have used his. But the rest of the sentence, the rest of the letter, and all of the writings that Paul had make it clear that his belief was in the one true God and the good news of Jesus being made known and allowing us to still know it today because of the Holy Spirit. So, again, you may not have even been aware that this was a point of contention in history, and even today in some circles, about this use of this word. But I hope this explanation helps you to better understand why we don't have to question Paul's orthodoxy and why we can trust the Bible fully and the gospel of Jesus completely.